My name is Kathrin Böhm. I'm a very close colleague of Kerstin and friend, and I'm very like this. Okay, of course, very honored to be here. I think my 5-minute reflection is probably going to be about this initial idea of this event, which was to have 3 seminars which support the profiling of Kerstin's practice, but that practice in general. And I think maybe just like reflecting back on the purpose of this meeting today and the other 2 seminars. Yeah, thanks. To have a kind of model of bringing research and research-led practice, but also like academic research and research as teaching together in one space and one construct. And I think whatever comes out with this book and the next step of this project, this is going to be, of course, incredibly important that this is done well. And I'm looking forward to this like promise that the idea of theory and practice, those different levels of experiencing and knowing and wanting to distinguish or not wanting to distinguish or wanting to be clear or wanting to be unclear. That's my big hope for the book, of course, that this becomes quite precise, however messy it's going to be done. I mean, I applauded your self-critique of like criticizing this idea of institutionalized rhetorics and this kind of like almost accelerating sophistication in language. And artists are just standing there going like, oh my God, it's amazing how you just can describe my practice. But is that actually my practice? I mean, how close do I feel to the language critics or curators are using to describe what I'm doing? And I think that's probably another challenge for this book and this kind of idea of profiling this kind of practice. And you have this unique opportunity of having the academy and the publication to maybe really double check this loop of practicing, formulating, profiling. But I think this idea of profiling and the urge to profile is quite present. Like, for me, probably more important than describing in ever more detail what those practices exactly do on the ground, but this kind of urge to give it quite a clear term, a term also that artists are happy with. Maybe it's one term, maybe it's many more. I have a practice that's quite close to Kerstin's, and I have this, of course, probably the same experience that people who are part of the process and experience the thing as a real thing have no difficulty recognizing it as art. However art educated the people you're working with are. So there's no problem recognizing it once you've experienced the reality of the thing. And maybe that goes back to your end bit. How can this kind of real experience be translated in a way that it becomes concrete for people who want to understand what you're doing? I mean, I often have this funny moment of like working years on a project and everybody knows it's an art thing, and then at the end they go like, so what do you do as an artist? And it's like, oh. And it's funny because no one is also not doubting that what we just did like was kind of somehow also art. But there's always this question of like wanting to understand it with like one medium, one term, something quite, oh yeah. And for a long time, I think I completely refused this because you don't want to oversimplify, and it's like participatory and new genre, like it's not so complicated. But I started to play with like terms when I describe what I'm doing, and I'm using different terms. I go like, oh yeah, we did an amazing building, or we did a really great sculpture. And that's stupid, and I'm testing this in public at the moment. But people are like, oh right, so I can see this. And then also it means that for someone who maybe didn't have an art-educated background, they can understand this not just as a personal experience, but also a project that has a history with an art of doing things. And then also understanding not just this one art project as one thing that happened in their life, but also as something that's part of a bigger history that spans society. So I think that's another reason why a kind of quite concrete term that describes something quite abstract, if not experienced, might be of help. So yeah, that was my 5 minutes.
Thank you. Will we?
Okay. My name is Meike, and my background is in architecture, so it's not in in art. And what I thought was really important for me in this event today is, or what I have drawn out of it is the question how to ask actually a very difficult but very important question, and that might be the question of possibility of an art practice to be a social practice and its involvement, the possibility of involving yourself in planning and in social change. And in architecture you have a very similar discourse that has been taken up. It's a very old discourse from the end of the 60s, you could say, that has become taken up just very recently again, and that was started, you can say, in the 68 with Manfredo Tafuri's idea of the architectural project, if the architectural project can actually be a critical project. And he answered that his answer was no, because architecture is already co-opted and is already always in the service of capitalism, so to say. And that is very similar, it's very similar accusations we hear when art, as soon as art is becoming part of planning practice, or when art projects are partnering up with any kind of, let's say, any kind of activities that might come very close to something that is planning or building on a more mundane level, let's say like that. So I was really, really happy of that, the richness to see, to learn about various strategies of what you have called, many of you have called the small experiments, but also to hear about concepts of speculative practice and life-way plans, for example, and also devices like your art way of thinking diagram, I think was really, really important. And what I think, what we should not, I think all these things are really, really important and can be very productive also for a critical practice, actually. But what we should not forget, I suppose, and that would be the question I would like to discuss, is that there also, I mean, I'm asking myself, what is the possibility of a critical art and a critical architecture practice to contribute to an important discussion like gentrification, for example, that you were taking up. And I think there are possible limits here, because there are very, very good intentional projects, or projects with very good intentions that have not that were not one-off projects, that have not been able to stop, but maybe have contributed to gentrification, and that has, and people, the artists behind that were also very much aware. And I think we have to be really we have also to look critically on our projects ourselves, and what they might contribute in long-term perspective to those developments. I agree that we should not continue to repeat the problematics of, or let's say, the power of capitalism. I think we should actually really sort of develop new concepts, point out, highlight those small experiments that sort of actually, that really actively working against that. But I think we should also discuss the risks and see those, try to handle things that we might not be able to see right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kerstin Jensen. I'm a curator currently working as a director at the Art Center in Malmö, Lund University. I've had a similar journey as Mick, coming into the academic world after many years of working as a freelance curator with focus on public art, working in public spaces, with art projects connected also to urban regeneration, urban planning. And I have a kind of chaos of thousands of notes that I want to address, but I try to focus on maybe two things. I think I think it's really important, like you say, that what the outcome of this project is, because it's quite unique. It's the size of the investigation in Kerstin's practice and all the questions around it is unique, and it's extremely important. And I think it's important also because there's some kind of, there's often a kind of polarization between, you can hear it in several of the presentation, also you, Mary, about the socially engaged practice that is being, it's being put in the corner of the art world, so in the kind of outskirts of the art world. So there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of critique being made on the feeling that you're not welcome in the art world, and I think it's you need to break that down, and you do that with good conferences like this, publications, and developing a full body of very well documented projects, and you need to find good ways to do that. So I think we need to. I think a lot of the times you would argue, if you have long-term socially engaged projects, that it's not important that you create an object, that you create a film or something. But I think it is. I think it's extremely important if you want to change the position that we have and have had for many years, that there is a kind of bastardization of the socially engaged artists in Copenhagen, Denmark at least. That has been the situation for a long time. Me and Kerstin has been taking part of a group of socially engaged artists, and me and a few other curators, really talking, reviewing each other's work. But it was started because there was no other platform, there was no institutions, no arts council that would take this kind of debate in. So we tried to create a language of what is it that we're doing. And I think the importance came because there wasn't this open door to these types of practices. And of course these things are changing, but what I'm stressing is just that this is important work. And I think it is important also to acknowledge that the kind of framing or how you follow up on these extremely complex processes that can take many, many years, how you do that, how you communicate it and store it, where these archives of experiences, where do they end? Of course, a lot of them, the strongest, are the ones that experience them themselves, but I think we need to take this into consideration. And then another thing is in relation to cultural planning, urban planning, how these types of practices are being used. I think the artists like Kerstin and similar practices are being included in cultural planning more and more, but not necessarily in a good way. So we need to talk about that today as well. What kind of a role does artists end up in today? And there's a lot of kind of copying, trying to take a strategy from an artist and kind of adopting it into some a similar. It looks like the same, but it's not the same. So we need to discuss that as well, to be critical. Yeah.
Thank you.
To start with, I'm neither an artist nor an architect. I studied economy, so I'm representing, or used to represent, a city in the southern parts of Sweden. I have 3 different thoughts, and the first one, after listening to everyone today, is that I believe that PARK LEK is one of several small steps questioning the existing practices and listening to the other experiences from other countries that we listened to today, and working within this field. I can see that small things are happening all over the world, not only here in Sweden. One of the most important things is that I believe is that, and Leah talked about it, these hybrids that's starting to pop up all over. The artists start to work as a planner, questioning the architect. And by doing that, we are starting to see a new kind of field. And what I can see is that there's no, if you look at, for example, the architectural education, it looks the same. That's been looking like for the last 100 years. They don't even have a dialogue experience. They don't study dialogue, and still they are the ones dealing with dialogue. And now artists are getting into that field too. And I've been a lot for several years wanting. I used to work at for the city and longing for who is going to lead these dialogues. I don't trust the architects, and I don't know if I trust the artists. And we need to create more of these hybrids between different fields of that can lead those discussions. That are the architects, the citizens, because we're using yesterday's tool when we plan the cities of tomorrow, and that's quite stupid. The second thing I was thinking of during the day and regarding the project was the aspect of time. What does time mean? And I thought it was very interesting that you, the last speaker, talked about time. That 10 years is nothing in from a city perspective, but for an urban planner, that's a very long time. And for an artist, that's an eternity. But you will never get or it's quite difficult to get so much money that you can stay in a place over time. And I think it takes time if you're going to, with all the gentrification issues that are going on, that time is needed. Time is what can actually change lots of things. And the time to not start with a goal, not knowing. It takes time to understand. But from the city's perspective, it's quite difficult to take time. And we need to start challenging what is long-term and short-term. The third thing I was thinking about, and I don't know if you've spoken about it, it's the management of places. When we work in Malmö and in different parts of Sweden with these places, and artists come in, both in residency or temporary, no matter what happens then? And once again, the time aspect, what happens in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? And I believe you who participated from Sundbyberg, the knowledge that will remain in Sundbyberg, whether there is a statue or whether this is a process that you have curated, the knowledge that remains in the neighborhood, the knowledge that will remain with these kids, they've learned something. And I believe that aspect needs to be taken care of, because that's what's actually going to change what you are talking about. You need to democratize these processes, and it's by having the knowledge to question the projects. The citizens that you were talking about, of course, they won't challenge anything because you don't understand. I didn't understand urban planning 5 years ago because I was working with totally different things, and now I understand how it affects me. So the question of the management, what remains when everyone else has left? What's left in Sundbyberg? What's left in Hallonbergen? I think that's one of the main questions that we need to take with us.
Thank you very much. Before inviting Leah and Mary Jane to respond, I just wonder if maybe the audience, anybody would like to pose a question, comment, response, reflection. Don't be shy.
But I also think that's where research comes in, or practice-led research. Yeah, and I mean, that was another comment, if I can make one more. sorry. But this idea of like profiling this practice and paying attention to what's actually happening. And I think one of the sad things with around this like socially engaged practice is that there isn't enough detailed writing. You know, there's whole essays on like why a certain brush stroke by someone is done in a certain way. And you think, gosh, the amount of writing about brush strokes, we could have this around social practice. And then it would be maybe also become clearer that there are those amazing nuances which you were pointing out, and what are they precisely? And what precisely in what practices doesn't work? So then you have the critical kind of being able to assess them, like for instance with like Kerstin's practice or mine, which are highly spatial, like architectural as practices, but not adaptable to like formalized planning processes. So if that was like research and debate, then you could immediately say if someone starts like an artist-architect collaboration, look, those are all the things you're gonna encounter and it's been written about, just make sure. And that's what I mean with like profiling and writing, and in more detail and with more attention to what artists want without homogenizing the ambition or the field, because the field is as diverse as you were describing it. Some is political, some is activist, others is formal, you know, it's quite...
I've got a terrible feeling that my question is sort of, you've actually just answered it already, Kathrin, but I'll say it anyway, which was, it was just trying to go back to the kind of the idea that's kind of popped up every now and again, and which you were talking about quite a lot, Mick, about trying to get away from the idea of the artist as this special person, that they have this special status. And I think this is where it kind of overlaps with what you're saying, kind of, Kathrin, is just, you know, so often these kinds of conversations and follow on, it's like, well, this is what artists can do when they come to a place, when they come to a space, they can do this. And I just keep thinking, I don't know what it is that they do. So it just sort of, again, it feels like a similar sort of situation there in terms of how do we describe, how do we actually know what it is that artists do? I don't know what it is that, a lot of it seems to fall back, I suppose, onto the idea that they are going to do something special and something kind of different. And that feels like a problem to me, you know? So yeah, so I don't know if anyone has any responses to that, or if that's just one of those observations.
Just in my practice, the artists I have worked with, they illuminated, they revealed what was happening underground in the texture of living of that place. That was it. It was nothing particularly special. It was not particularly aesthetically interesting. All they were a conduit for revealing something, for bringing something to the surface, which I very much appreciated, and we got on with that. So I don't put special judgment of aesthetics or value on that. The value of that work is the same as the value of the participants in that work. Each of the participants also revealed themselves to the group, to the city, and within that practice, the artists just helped to reveal whatever else was there. If somebody dabbled in poetry, then they went back and looked at old poetry in there, and they revealed a particular way of singing that poetry, and that was fine. That was fine. But end of story. Okay, so it wasn't anything particular mythical, epical, or something that the artist had done. Get it? But it was useful. It was useful. But so I see it in a pragmatic way. So I don't see it in this quasi-religious thing.
What if it didn't happen?
If it didn't happen, we would have moved on to some other exercise, some other way of getting at what was there, like the basket weaving. But
you were looking for that kind of thing.
yeah, because I was looking for that. But because if you're involved in the process, you're committed, you begin to love the place, the people there, and you commit yourself. So then you associate to that your teams of people. Could be artists or it could not be artists.
Right, but there's so many places or situations where there isn't somebody like you, and then that, you know, whether you call it disruptive or whatever, but that spark that the artist can ignite, maybe successfully or not, is all the more necessary. And in a sense, that's special. It's not the special sanctified work of art thing or their status, but what they created through that process is definitely has an exceptional moment. You can say something.
Thank you. I want to raise the question really of legitimization processes within these types of modes of practice. And I suppose from watching your presentation, Mary Jane, what I was trying to sort of track was the different epistemic sort of frameworks at play. And it seemed to me that in the observational frame, in the first kind of process of the team entering the sort of context and the community and its geographies, and I understood that there was a whole load of stuff going on there. The one thing that is happening is both the building of knowledge, but also becoming recipient to knowledge and the reading of knowledge that already existing, and what it is towards the end of your presentation you termed as an existing sustained community. And I think it's important that we sort of potentially recognize that in these sort of modes of practice, we're not always entering into communities who don't have tactics, strategies, and methods of sustaining themselves, but yet amidst that they are under notions of threats. That's one kind of sort of aspect. But what I'm curious about in this is why we still require, desire, or implement particular modes of artistic or cultural legitimacy in order to highlight, spark, underline, illuminate these communities and their knowledge sets. What is the question there? What is happening that the knowledge of these communities is being so disavowed that actually art still functions in this illuminatory evangelical legitimizing process within communities that actually have tactics and strategies for sustaining themselves?
There's sort of two ways I'm hearing that, and with your legitimizing, notion there. And one is this relationship between culture with a capital C and culture with a lowercase c, right? So the culture with the capital C, whether the person is wildly egotistical or not on the ground, but anyway, the culture with the capital C, the artist who this is their profession or creative, other kind of creative professional, is doing what the arts have always done, which is to record, to reflect, to create from culture that they are seeing. Art before, the famous artists, the capital C artists, right? For all of what we want to say is individual inspiration and genius and so forth, is a reaction between them and their environment, something in the culture. So artists coming into these places, having an interaction, is not to, and those that I'm dealing with, is to recognize that there is culture there, and then also to process it through their cultural making. It's very different than, while there was this sort of a political dirty laundry side of the Giancarlo Menotti story, what was at the base of that is that here was an individual who thought the culture with a capital C, opera, was something he created, that he was a maestro, a master of that, and that what he had done was to come to Charleston, a place that had no culture. That's wild, right? Okay, so yes, it is that interaction between the high and low C, and then hopefully with a kind of relaxed, generous, more open way of working in social practice that isn't playing out a hierarchy, right? But desiring that interaction. The other legitimizing, right, which also comes, is that people living in Phillips understood urban planning, and they've been fighting urban planning for a long time. And Richard Habersham went to every meeting, that the reason that this gentleman, was the president is because he didn't have little kids. He went to meetings several times a week. Nonetheless, when he shows up at one meeting with a bunch of artists in a row, and then the guy with the dreadlocks gets up and says that he's chair of, environmental and landscape planning at the University of California, Berkeley, they never got over that. And so, it brings capital, it brings cultural power, and artists can lend power to others. And so this daylighted that Phillips existed. The Spoleto Festival did not understand why they were doing this. Of course, I raised the money, so whatever. It was easy for them. But year after year, they gave visibility to this situation and shared their cultural power that they otherwise wouldn't have, so that in their program book that looks like a big magazine that comes out with every festival, several running, were articles about how you read the landscape in Phillips, what's going on in there. That was helpful. And in the end, the director of the Spoleto Festival, who again, in the beginning said we can't build a community center, right? But he had said we can't paint a house either, when the camouflage house that flashed up there. But nonetheless, he stayed with the course, even though he was, had the freaking out moments. He ended up being the one in taking over the administration of a new foundation, actually passed money then on to the Phillips community so that it was able to buy communal land. One of the things about the community center is there was no communally held land. They then bought land along the creek that someday, should they build a community center, they had. So actually, vis-a-vis the festival and their power, they gave some hundreds of thousands of dollars to this community to do that. So all of those things, matter, and those come through. We want to provoke, but we can't erase the capital C. But we can use it well when we can.
Do we have any other comments, questions?
I'll try to make it short. It's just picking up on where you ended, Leah, with saying you can't leave. And what you said, also you, Victoria, and also what you said about we actually really need a model for the sustainability of the impact of a project like Park Lek. And then I just remembered, Kerstin, that you, in a discussion, I think it was in Copenhagen, said that Park Lek is not a sustainable project because if I leave, or when I leave a closed model, then the discussion stops, and so the whole point is missed. So the question is really how to gain that sustainability by somehow implementing an open model so that the process will go on. So that's one thing, and I think that's very much in the practice. And the other thing is, of course, on a structural level. So that might be two different models we're talking about. The model you're talking about is more like, how do we get these practices implemented into planning? So maybe, Leah, that's something you would have a comment on with your experience in urban planning. But Kerstin first, yeah.
So I think there was a part missing in your quote, where I said that I think it's quite important that I leave, that I think it's quite important that there is, in relation to your question also, Jason, that in a way, if we don't consider ourselves as having the power of enter any circumstance at any time to go on and go out and tell you guys what to do and to be there and speak, so to speak, from me to them, but that it is the other way around, that I'm actually a hunter. I'm hunting for the missing piece in my own understanding of the world, and I find that with the architect, with the economist, with the planners, with everybody. I think times are so urgent that we need to accept that we are not the solution one by one. We need to go and to put this forward in these times at least. We need to do what Christina, for instance, have been working for here in Sweden for many, many years to make people speak with each other, well knowing that there is other knowledges. So I proclaim the ditch between all these different forms of knowledge, forms of experience, and I think that's also in play in your project, but I think it's in the sense that it's a learning process. We have to go through a learning process to reprogram our minds to look for what we are looking for, because the things that we've been using up till now, they don't fit with the reality. And so that's why I go out there, because I've learned so much from these people. And it's clear I have to leave, otherwise I would be interrupting a process that should be self-governed.
At this late stage, whether we should get involved in this big discussion. But I mean, is there something you in particular are after? Is it a structure of thinking, a system of thinking? Or is it something within the discipline, or your discipline in particular, whether it's planning or urban design or something, that you would want to see happen? Because from my perspective, as an outsider from all these disciplines, as an observer of society, if you want, what I think we need is this more and more of these inquiry systems, more and more of these mapping systems where we go down at the ground, we question the received wisdom about a particular policy or a particular initiative. We pull together teams of interdisciplinary teams that are relevant to that location. We then interrogate the evidence coming back from this set of meetings and interviews, etc. We work with the local community, the representatives of the local community. I'm not saying with everybody, because not everybody would be interested or would be there or whatever. So it's new this way. It's an iterative process in a step-by-step basis on which you question the current system of doing planning, of city making, etc. Out of which I don't know what kind of particular tools can emerge, whether master planning would be the tool you first ditch or keep or not. We have to test them out. And the idea is the more tests we do on small scale, the more we shorten the gap between thinking and action, and the more we evaluate the experience, so the more we learn from the experience on the ground, and the more we disseminate the learning on that, I think the more we advance towards this iterative system of placemaking, which I think I have in mind personally. I don't have models in mind, no toolkits. No, it's just my
I kind of quite oppose the idea. The idea of like tests and experiments, because I think one of the few qualities that kind of practice has, that it practices the one-to-one, and the one-to-one is practiced by not very many practices. You know, architecture doesn't do one-to-one; they plan 10 years ahead. Everything is like in the future. It's never immediate. It's never the possible is never actual, and I think that's what art practice brings as a real quality to a lot of those processes, because a lot of other professions don't practice it.
I think I was actually asking for something very much more like when you said that Kerstin should not have left from Hallenbergen and Øya. It was more like the question of the school now being privatized and all that process of what the sustainability in the project in that sense. So it's more, when I'm asking about a model or a structural change, it's more like on a political level, and your experience in, I don't know, we don't have the answer for that, and that's what we're all working for, and also today here bringing light to it and all that in a bigger perspective. But I was just sort of asking for maybe your thoughts on how to influence, how can I put it, the politics on structural level, so to sort of implement these processes more. Does that make sense? In a better more way?
I mean, there is a lot of experiments now happening with participatory budgeting, with people up in Scotland producing their own energy and then recycling the gains they have from that energy back into the community and then managing that budget themselves. So if there is a school to be built, the community will decide what kind of a school that is. And then they go about doing it. These are micro experiments. So, you know, we cannot deliver a revolution old style like in the 70s I could have done then. It would be ridiculous today, frankly. But we need a bloody revolution. So, you know, what can I say? I don't have the models. Like, I don't know if somebody will have the model. I can see a lot of activism, and I think it's interesting. And all I want to do is bring together these different examples of activism in different spheres, whether it's cultural, economic, or recycling, or whatever it is. And then I want to try and see if by mixing that, some kind of approach or some kind of set of ideas will come back for the next generation, because it's too late for me.
So it's a comment about Kerstin leaving and your comment about management. So Kerstin has left. She left a set of principles, and this was part of the decision to act on her proposal that was taken in local council in 2014, and they have reworked the planning department, and they're trying to work with these principles. And I am engaged in continue to work with the planning department, and we have invited new artists to try to make sense of the principles left behind by Kerstin. So there is a continued work being done.
Can I comment on that then? Because as you were saying before, regarding if you know about planning processes and how they go on in the local community, what I've been seeing, I work with what we in Sweden call the million program areas, quite deprived areas all over they were built. And what we can see in them is that it's fantastic that you actually managed to change the plan in Hallonberg and Ör. But when I listen to you that live there, I understand that the context is almost the same. These kids are still feeling the same, the feeling of hopelessness, that they don't have a future. And you can understand physical planning more or less, but you do understand inequality. They feel that they are treated in a different way. And you can change cities and you can change urban planning and physical details, but it's not until you start working on the social issues that you actually commit to change. Because these houses, if they are put there or there, of course they're going to make some changes, but as long as these children don't feel like part of this society, we're going to have bigger problems.
I wonder, I mean, one of the things that's cropping up is the question of different types of expertise, whether it's the planner, the artist, how one can acquire new competencies by learning a particular discourse, getting on the inside. But is this kind of, when you say the million program deprived areas, I mean, are we saying that the process of planning, that it generated these spaces, or this is just something that happened by accident? I mean, it seems to me it's as if the problems that we have are somehow engendered by nature, and then the question is which tools do we reach for to start addressing them, rather than saying it is the disciplines of architecture and planning, and it is the current systems of local democracy and national democracy, it is these systems that have produced systems of exclusion, you know, the green belt around the enclave of the underclass in order to keep them separate from the middle class. I mean, these are not accidents. These are techniques that have been sharpened over decades. So and one of the things I'm wondering is, there was two propositions that seem to be emerging over the day. One was that in some sense, whether it's in the planning context, whether it's in the context of an individual project or a larger curatorial program, that what's wanted is an open-endedness that will both resist instrumentalization, so that it won't be immediately turned to some purpose that's extrinsic to the situation, but also that in somehow this open-endedness is something that allows the different disciplinary positions to get beyond themselves. So the planner can step out of the planning frame, the architect can step out of the architect frame, and the artist can step out of their artist framing and enter into some kind of common situation where the disciplinary blinkers are removed in some way. But I'm just wondering if this looking for models is maybe rather a question of taking more seriously the proposition that in some way we are disabled by our specialist knowledge, that we're disabled by how much we know already or how well we're positioned within our particular situations.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment briefly on what you said about building those systems of exclusion when you pointed to planning and architecture, because I think that, for example, the million homes program areas, they're a very good example for just trying to build away the exclusion, you know, building in the Swedish model where you do not have social housing, but you have a public housing, giving everybody the same opportunity, and building enough housing so that people have the possibility to choose. And I mean, nowadays we have the opposite. We have too little houses, and the allmännyttan, the public housing has been sold out to a very large degree. But I think it's not. It's a little bit limited to only see this in relationship to let's say the fabric, you know, the materiality or the building and planning. I think nowadays we have too little planning. We have too much. We have too many investors who dominate what is being planned. I think we have too little public control over how planning is done, and not the opposite. I just want to say that.
I love this discussion about the million homes, because ever since I started working in Sweden 16 years ago or something, I just thought the million homes was like the model I could have imagined in Italy or in other countries if we had this kind of things, which we had in 1963, but only for 2 or 3 years, and not on the scale of the million homes. And I was thinking, this is the best thing I have ever seen in terms of helping working classes, helping people who could not afford to have their own private home back then in the 50s and 60s, to have a decent and well-designed home. So to me, this remains the standard, the gold standard in the million homes, etc. The problem comes with the recent, I mean the 80s and 90s policies by the Swedish government to house in there and to cluster in there refugees or immigrants or something. That is the problem. That is the wrong policy. I don't think the policy of building a million homes was the wrong one, personally, as an external observer. So the stigma comes from the policies that have been implemented later on that. And I think we should attack those policies, which are constantly being regurgitated and repeated by the current government, I gather. Within the refugees.
I totally agree, because the buildings themselves, the architecture and the materials used in Sweden building the million homes program, they're amazing in Sweden.
But the dream, the vision, I think the social vision was interesting.
Both the vision and how it actually was built, because in other European countries they build almost the same buildings, but they build it with cheap materials. Here in Sweden we build it with fantastic materials. The thing is that they're 60 years old, or it's time to renovate them. And as you were saying, we sold out large parts of that, and the problem with the discussion here in Sweden regarding how we're going to build, because we're lacking 700,000 apartments right now, and the discussion is, are we going to build the same? And we have a very narrow discussion of building houses instead of building cities, and with all the things that you are talking about today, I see that if we just build houses, 700,000 apartments, we're going to be having more, like, huge problems 30 years from now, because we're going to have a building stock that is, the old parts will be falling apart, and the new ones are going to be really bad. And I really don't think that they're going to have any artists taking part of those discussions if we're going to build 700,000 apartments, because the time aspect isn't there. So if we really want to influence anything, influence the politics that actually is taking place right now regarding how we're going to build the coming 10 years. Because the time aspect comes up time and time again that we should not have a predicted goal. And what we actually are, or our politicians are doing right now, it's that they have a predicted goal. They know exactly what they want to build. They want to build not a city, they want to build buildings. And we see it here in Gothenburg, we see it in Malmö, and I know that you're seeing it in different parts of both the US and England. So big thing that I think artists should do now is challenge the politics of today, because that's where we have a huge problem.
Yeah, I just thought the second part of what you said, or your question about the disciplines. You were thinking of something, that something would happen to the disciplines, they would change, and you also said you were speaking of hybrid practices and so on. And I must say, I quite like this idea that architects are architects and planners are planners and artists are artists, but that they can collaborate in new and different ways. I think that how I see it is that could be the most productive way of really changing things, as Kerstin's project was, as there was this possibility to, as you actually made it happen, that there were structural change. There is a change in processes, and the cultural and the planning department, that they started to talk to each other and they moved closer to each other. There seems to have, and I think that's a really important difference from before, but I wonder if that would have happened if you have turned planner, for example. I think there is also an enormous value in that, that there is disciplinary knowledge, but that we actually learn side by side to each other, and we learn to sort of cooperate and talk to each other.
Now, that very promising proposition for the future finishes exactly on time at 1800. So, as a master stroke of temporal planning, we're reaching the end of our proceedings.
I'd just like to say that there is an opening with the students of the MA1s at the Medical History Museum, which is at the end of Avenue, and it's called Totally Sick, and that's why I have my jacket on. But thank you very much for the dialogue.
Can we, before you leave the room, can we thank our speakers, our respondents, and the organisers and all the people in the background who've been making it work, and also our audience.